Dear God, we're thankful that we can be here. We're thankful for the coolness in this room. We think of others who are not so comfortably situated, and we pray for them as well. We also hope we'll have a good time thinking about Roy this morning. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, this is the third anniversary to the very date of Roy Branson's death, and we are going to think a little bit about that together. And I sent on the email a quiz for you to consider, and I wonder if you have it here. Does everybody have the quiz here this morning? Let me see if I can get a copy for myself. Here it is. Okay, let's work on this together and see how well we do. The quiz is scored on a rights minus wrong basis, so that one takes how many errors one makes, not from the total possible, but from the total correct answers that you receive. So if you missed one question, you don't get 9 out of 10, you get 8 out of 10 because you subtract the 1 from the 9. So we do this in quizzes that are really, really easy, so that there'll be some challenge to them. Okay, which of the following did Roy's ethical thinking prioritize? Values, virtues, visions, or verdicts? What is it? Anybody want to take a run at that?
Visions?
Visions, that's right. Why visions, Peter?
Well, because he was thinking big, he was not limited only to the local problems. He was an international thinker.
That's right. That's right. Now, in ethics, there are people who do value theory. There are people who do virtue theory. There are people who do verdict theory, that is, applying moral principles to particular cases. But there's a whole new approach to ethics, which says what ethics needs to do is not decide what's wrong, but to imagine what the possibilities are. So often this is called apocalyptic ethics, and I'll read some from you about that from Roy in just a bit. True or false? Roy held that there are two kinds of Adventism, which approximately correspond to the books The Great Controversy and The Desire of Ages. False. Okay. Now, Dr. Pauline, who's here, has made this distinction, and I think quite successfully. I read recently of a report of what happened in Rome. I gather from that report that you drew this distinction, and it was really well received. What I heard and read was that Dr. Pauline's report was scheduled for one meeting place, and did it have to be moved to another meeting place? Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, we had 50 seats and 250 people showed up, so there was interest, I guess.
50 seats and 250 people showed up, and this distinction between the two kinds of Adventism, I gather, had a good reception. Now, did you talk about this specifically, or was this part of the larger picture that you were sharing?
No, just part of a larger picture.
Okay, but Dr. Pauline, Dean Pauline, has shared this distinction in other contexts, and it rings true, right? When we read the book The Great Controversy and when we read the book Desire of Ages, they do have a different feel to them. Now, Roy's somewhat, I think, unusual claim is that the book Great Controversy, or that kind of thinking, apocalyptic thinking, gave birth or gives birth to books like The Desire of Ages, so that we ought not to think of them as in tension with each other, but as one giving birth to the other. But that's a very, very controversial claim, and I think one that he needs to make more forcefully, and we'll see something from him on that later. Okay, Roy's understanding of what the crucifixion of Jesus accomplished was most like which of these? Anselm, forensic satisfaction; Abelard, moral influence; or Gustav Aulén, cosmic conflict. Given what you already know, which one of these would it be? Cosmic conflict, right? You're going to start seeing a pattern here. He's wanting to look at the big picture and struggles between groups. One thing Roy did not want to do is to think of the Christian life as largely an existential one. That is, a life that unfolds with our own preoccupations, with our own inner anxieties and stresses and strains, and our own feeling that we might be unworthy before God. He thought that what was happening between people and among people was much more important than what was happening within them. And I think, in other words, he was much more politically inclined than he was psychologically inclined. So, number 4, which of these books of the Bible was Roy most interested in? Genesis, Psalms, Micah, John, Romans, or Revelation? Given what you already know, what? Revelation, right, that's exactly right. A pattern is developing here. Which of these would he have preferred for the motto of Loma Linda University, health? Excuse me. To make the whole person whole, treating the patient as person, the healing of the nations, continuing the healing ministry of Jesus, let justice roll like a river. Which one?
Healing of the nations.
Healing of the nations, that's right, the healing of the nations. And I noticed that here and there that's being picked up by the university. We've moved from to make man whole ever so quietly and adroitly to continuing the healing ministry of Jesus. But I think Roy would like to have had us move a little further than that. Which of these interested him the most? Young Ellen White, middle-aged Ellen White, or elderly Ellen White? Given what you know already, what part of her life was she most exuberant and most cosmological and most outspoken? Young. That always startled me. The Ellen White that he much preferred was the Ellen White who was somewhat unpredictable, somewhat, I don't want to say volcanic, but she would come up with things that are a little bit arresting now and then. People weren't quite expecting that. I didn't realize until reading Dr. Lefteraw's book that the Millerites, the Millerite people were quite in favor of visions, but the Millerite leaders were most definitely opposed to them. And they passed resolution after resolution condemning visions and things like that throughout 1843 and 1844 on both sides of the Great Disappointment. So Joseph Bates and his skepticism about Ellen White sort of reflects the Millerite view, the leadership of the Millerite views in general. Okay, to which of these human groupings did Roy invest most of his thought and work? Individuals, families, associations, cities, states, or global humanity?
Global humanity.
Global humanity. How many say global humanity? No.
Association.
What is it?
Association.
Associations. Why, Donna?
Well, that goes back to his days, I think, at Harvard and his Federalist papers.
That's right.
Yeah.
And at Harvard, what? He ran into the thinking of Talcott Parsons.
Oh, yes.
And Talcott Parsons was a sociologist, and he was very interested in how mid-sized organizations can have a positive impact on the larger group, larger than an individual could, but not be so unwieldy as the group as a whole. So Roy took that very seriously and devoted much of his life to voluntary associations. And I can think of 5 of them in which he was actively involved. One is the Adventist Forum. It is a voluntary association within the Adventist Church. And then in the Washington, D.C. area, there was also the Center for Religion and Politics, whatever it was properly called at Washington Adventist University. But there was also the Interfaith Coalition Against Tobacco, in which Roy took a very, very strong stand against the tobacco industry, and he worked with other denominational leaders and had a big impact on the sale of tobacco products in this country. And I've often reflected on this. Dr. Bruce Branson was a surgeon, and I've wondered how many surgeries could he have performed in a week? What do you think? How many in a day? 5 in a day? 5 in a day? More than that?
He did probably.
I'm sorry?
I said the kind he didn't, that would be a lot.
Okay, let's just say 5 times 5 is 25. And then how many is that a month? 100, and that would be 1,200 in a year. The number of people whose lives were lengthened by smoking less was in the hundreds of thousands. It's an amazing thing. And they were able to calculate that for every cent increase in taxes on tobacco, so many fewer people would smoke and that many more lives would be saved. So that Interfaith Coalition against smoking, against tobacco, we call it, was very, very important. So the Adventist Forum, the Institute at Washington Adventist University, the Interfaith Coalition against tobacco, but also in the Washington, D.C. area, the Kennedy Institute, which is another voluntary organization put up by the Kennedy family there at Georgetown University. So that makes 4, and there was one more, and that's the Center for Christian Bioethics out here. So Roy spent a lot of time working with these mid-sized associations, thinking of them as positive forces within much larger groups. According to Roy, which of the following books in the Bible's wisdom literature was Loma Linda's theology most like? Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, or Job? What do you think? Song of Solomon. I've got Song of Solomon, Job. The number of options is decreasing here swiftly. Proverbs is right. Now, this was not a particularly complimentary thing that Roy would say about us at Loma Linda. He was persuaded, and he would use this language. Well, you folk are preparing, this was before he came here, you folk are preparing people for leaderships in the existing order of things. You're not really fundamentally challenging the way things now are. And the sort of superficial, quote unquote, maxims one finds in Proverbs, some people put it that way, are appropriate for folk who are being prepared to serve in institutional roles in established societies. And that's what you folk are doing. And that's why you emphasize the continuity of reason and science. You want everything to be smooth and together, and you don't want to challenge anybody in any very serious way. And so he thought we were like Proverbs. Now, when you think of the Bible, most people would not say that Proverbs is the most exciting and enriching and ennobling book. Actually, when one looks at it, it has much in it that's very promising. But Roy wasn't thinking of that. He was sort of saying, well, yes, you folk are philosophers, but you really should be poets. You really should be poets. Of course, what does Stanley Hauerwas say about that? Theologians are failed poets. All right? I sort of like Ecclesiastes, not because it's so somber at the beginning, but at the end it talks about remembering your Creator in the days of your youth. That's a very powerful thing, and I read that when I was a youngster, and it made a big difference to me, because then it says, when you're old, you'll have no regrets, and that's true too. Okay, Roy believed that the Christian moral life is most like which one of these? Business, education, war, law, or medicine? Given what you know already, what is it?
War.
War, that's right. The Christian life is a battle. Which of the following theological big B's did Roy have? With which of these did he have the most kinship? Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Walter Brueggemann, Mel Brunner, or Rudolf Bultmann?
If I remember correctly, I think it's Brueggemann.
Brueggemann!
Because he was quoting, he liked very much his expression, the healing of the nation.
He did it, and he liked also Brueggemann's prophetic imagination. And Roy was amongst those who thought that the best thing ethics can do is to burst our conventional ways of thinking into exciting new alternatives. So let me see if I can find something here that will relate to that. It goes way back in our history. Looks like my computer turned off while I was talking to you, so I'll have to get it started again. While I'm starting this, let me just talk about what the situation was. and that is, when we started the Center for Christian Bioethics, naturally people wanted to know how the center would relate to the institution on this campus. Was the center going to be a priest which would serve the interest of the institution, in effect being sort of like the public relations arm of Loma Linda University Medical Center in particular? And there were some who thought that perhaps should be our role, and others who thought that that would not be an appropriate role for us. And so there was I wouldn't say there was tension, but there was a sorting out of alternatives, and we had to think through that question. I remember one time Dr. Bruce Branson came to my office and he said, "Dave, let's go to Redlands and we'll form a not-for-profit corporation. That will be the Ethics Center, totally outside of the university." And I said, "No, really would like the Ethics Center to be a child of the university, not a neighbor of the university." Well, that shows some of the issues. This wasn't contentious at all, but we had to think through what our role would be. And other people thought, well, the way you're organizing things to be a part of the university means you won't have the intellectual independence to really say what needs to be said in moments of intense uncertainty. So that whole issue was very much at play. And so we thought that through, and there are these models in religious literature. There is the priestly model. This is the person according to the typology, and these typologies are sort of rough-hewn, but the priest is the one who serves the institution and tries to improve it from within. The priest works quietly, the priest works behind the scenes, the priest works with bureaucracies, and is not going to unsettle anybody, because that would lose the priest his credibility. So that's one way of thinking of ourselves as ethicists or as the Ethics Center, and that didn't seem quite right to us. On the other hand, there is this prophetic approach where the ethicist stands outside, if not outside of the institution economically and administratively, but outside of the institution ethically and spiritually, and thinks of himself or herself as sort of like an art critic, not the artist himself or herself, but the art critic who's assessing what's going on, and is by no means to be misunderstood as part of the public relations endeavor of the institution as a whole. So you have these conflicts, and these conflicts go all through the literature in ethics. But I was impressed by something that a man named James Gustafson, who taught at Yale Divinity School for a long time and then moved over to the University of Chicago Divinity School, said, and his view was this: a common characteristic of the priest, Gustafson said. Now, we're using these as typologies, not as actual Old Testament categories, but sort of sociological typology. One of the things that characterizes both the priest and the prophet is that they don't listen. Do you know what that wolf sound is? It's my phone. Where's my phone? All right, turn that off. Nobody mixes up my phone with anybody else's phone. It sounds like a wolf. So there you go. Better turn that off. There's just one more thing to make this morning. What is when? Okay. So where was I? That totally. You don't listen. I totally lost my way of thinking. Okay, Gustafson. And so Gustafson said the priest will not listen to anybody. The prophet will not listen to anybody. We need another model, and he called that model the participant. The participant is one who speaks to the situation, but is also one who is willing to listen. And out of that interaction will come a positive result. And we looked at that, we said to ourselves, well, we really don't want to be priests in the sense that that's understood here at Loma Linda. Neither do we really want to be prophets in the way that that's understood, but what Gustafson says about being participants is just about what we would like to accomplish. So I put this is really early on here. So this is just a very brief editorial, really early on, but what's important is to watch the date here. This is winter of 1985, long time ago. But the sequence between this and what Roy wrote is very important. James Gustafson, a distinguished theologian who has taught ethics at Yale University and the University of Chicago, once published an essay on how ethicists understand themselves. Some, he wrote, see themselves as preservers of the status quo, as high priests ordained to guarantee that nothing new or different ever happens. Other ethicists see themselves as prophets, commissioned to denounce existing institutions and relationships in the name of the utopia they herald. Despite their other differences, Gustafson held, priests and prophets are similar in their almost, this is, I'm summarizing Gustafson. This is his thinking, not mine, but I thought it was great. In their almost arrogant assumption that they should have the last word, whether it be commendation or condemnation. Okay. Just a little bit more. Pardon me?
Where would Jesus fit in one of these categories?
Well, that depends whom you ask that question. And I think that Roy would clearly say that Jesus was a prophet and an apocalyptic prophet. And I think it's fair to say that, and Dr. Pauline is here who can fill us in on that, but I do think the apocalyptic nature of the whole New Testament and even the life of Jesus has been more and more pronounced in biblical scholarship. Do you want to say anything about that? I think there used to be a sharp distinction drawn between apocalyptic and prophecy, and between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation and the letters of Paul. But increasingly, I think New Testament scholars, and I sort of listen to what they're saying, New Testament scholars are seeing apocalyptic thought permeate the whole of the New Testament.
Yeah, that would be correct. I think about 100 years ago, the prevailing view among scholars was apocalyptic was fringe, and to try to understand Jesus, etc., from this sort of a personal spirituality view. Schweitzer, I think, was the famous missionary doctor, was also a world-class theologian, and he drew out the fact that Jesus was very apocalyptic. That was resisted for a couple of generations, but more and more key scholars have come back and said, no, it is apocalyptic. So to see the entire New Testament as apocalyptic in a sense of that term, not in the technical sense, but in a theological sense, if you will, has been supported as accurate.
I think that's right. And I think Roy was very much aware of that New Testament scholarship and was building on it. And he, of course, was thinking of what some people call apocalyptic consciousness. What is that? That's a kind of a self-awareness of one's life as part of a great cosmic conflict, and that this cosmic conflict is between major powers, institutions, groups, and some of these are more than human, and so our lives are positioned in a time of conflict. One cannot help but think of Roy's grandfather's book, The Drama of the Ages, right? That's sort of thinking, great controversy thinking. Thirdly, apocalyptic consciousness thinks that history is open, that things are not foreordained, things can change, and how we act makes a big difference. That's another feature of apocalyptic consciousness. I think another one is a sense that turn out as we hope, that we don't look at the future pessimistically, nor do we look at the future with overconfidence, but we are of the view that we can do things that will make the future a positive outcome. So another feature, though, I think we need to mention of apocalyptic consciousness is that it's joyful, it's praiseful, it's doxological, it's liturgical. And this was very much a part of Roy's experience and thinking. For many people, apocalyptic literature is grim and almost savage. And he did not experience that at all. He would emphasize those portions of the book of Revelation which picture the saints singing around the throne of God in honor of the Creator. So that kind of broad sweep of apocalyptic consciousness has taken over much of New Testament scholarship, and Roy was building on that. So, all of that is by way of saying, yes, I think he would have thought of Jesus as very apocalyptic. He would have followed Albert Schweitzer and the group that followed him. I think Albert Schweitzer's father-in-law was Weiss, wasn't he? And he had done some work on this as well. So there's been a real shift, say, from people like Harnack in the 19th century, who viewed Jesus in terms of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, sort of a very smoothed over Jesus. And the Jesus that's emerging more frequently in these days is a rather disruptive one, in the right sense of the word. One whose job wasn't to keep everything perfectly. But here's the paragraph that's important. The Ethics Center of Loma Linda University was designed to be more participatory than priestly or prophetic. So we're just right out there. We had thought that thing through, and we had taken a position, and we had located the Ethics Center institutionally in a way that it could be neither priestly nor prophetic in those stereotypically ways, but participatory. Okay, the Ethics Center of Loma Linda University was designed to be more participatory than priestly or prophetic. In the meetings Gustafson gave them, those terms, the work of the center is different from that of a typical university department in that it calls upon specialists in many disciplines to probe current ethical issues. The medicine and society conferences, which are now called bioethics ground rounds, held monthly in the Loma Linda University Medical Center, are the annual spring workshop on medical ethics, the articles and update, and the seminars held for administrators developing important policies all include Loma Linda's ethicists, but they also involve many others, historians, clinicians, researchers, biblical exegetes, lawyers, and so forth. So the center was not to be a place where the prophets stood up and declared the word of the Lord. The center was to be a place where ethicists interacted with people with other specialties, with the idea that ethicists can learn as well as teach. So it's to be much more interactive. So that's how we spelled it out. That's how we talked to our investors in the Ethics Center, and some like that, some didn't like that, fair enough. But that we sort of positioned ourselves that way. Now, this is in the winter, right, of 1985, and let me see if I can pull up, I think I can, something that Roy wrote. So, notice the date on that. That little editorial I put in our journal, by the way, that little update had a big impact on the world of ethics, because it was an eight-page newsletter, but pages 1 and 2 and pages 3 and 4 were devoted to practical, administrative, and financial things about the center, but always the middle pages were devoted to something of some academic substance. And people around, and we sent this to all the members of the Society for Christian Ethics free. So people around the ethics world would read our little newsletter because they knew that sandwiched in between all this business, which was not particularly interesting to them, there were articles that were interested. They did find interesting. And major thinkers would respond to what we put in our little journal. I think it's too bad that for financial reasons that had to go by the way, and I understand the leadership of the center now wants to revive that, something on the internet, but you know, it's not the internet, but there's nothing like opening up your mailbox and having that document right there. And so I would hope that eventually we could get back to sending something to all the members of the Society for Christian Ethics. Not only did that have an impact in the academic world with people like Bertrand Rasmussen at Union Seminary, and Stanley Hauerwas chimed in on things that we had written in Update, but also it drew to us students from around the circle who had a feeling that we were doing something that was of academic interest here at Loma Linda. So for a while we had really strong cohorts of ethics students coming here and getting their MAs, and then they went out to other universities and have been serving very well. The most recent one to come home was Brian Brock, who's now teaching at the University of Aberdeen. And one of his colleagues there is Stanley Hauerwas. Not bad. It was our aspiration to be third. We knew we could never catch up with the Hastings Center, never catch up with the Kennedy Institute, but if we could be third, that would be great. And I think people who feel like they play a tennis tournament and come in second and go home weeping shouldn't do that. They should say, I came in second after 3 weeks of a tournament. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. And our aspiration was to have the best bioethics library west of the Mississippi. I haven't looked recently, but I think that that's the case. Last I heard, they were taking books out of that library because it's too full and trying to fill it up with other ones. Okay, now, this date, summer of 1985, is actually later, right? And so I wouldn't say Roy was rebuking us, but he wasn't complimenting us. This is what he says. The Loma Linda Ethics Center will certainly achieve high standards of excellence. A greater challenge will be for it to speak with a distinctive voice. The Hastings Center, or the Kennedy Institute for that matter, does not need a West Coast echo. The center will contribute most to the field of bioethics if it has the courage to be original. Now, he wrote this with what I had written in mind. He did not like this idea of being participatory. He wanted us to be prophetic and not to become caught in the somewhat self-serving world of bioethics. Let's face it, the world of bioethics is overwhelmingly white, male, and prosperous, and the issues that the world of bioethics address are the issues that affect high technology and very sophisticated issues in medicine. They're not the issues that are typically going to make a difference in thousands of people's lives, and Roy thought that we were making a mistake. And I want you to hear what he wrote about this. He developed a typology that amounted to pastor, and then priest, and then prophet. So let me see if I can pick this up here. Now, we were all good friends, but this was a matter of some difference of conviction, and I think it's an important one. The Ethics Center at Loma Linda, committed to its apocalyptic heritage, will not simply serve as a pastoral role with its medical students from third world countries. Certainly it will sensitize those students to respect the informed consent of their patients, but it will also challenge the public to consider the results when this country absorbs healthcare professionals from the third world who are desperately needed in their home countries. An ethics center true to its apocalyptic heritage will confront the consumption of a disproportionate amount of the world's food by the United States and Western Europe at a time when other people are starving. To cite another example, such a center would reflect in a pastoral way with students as to whether compassion would lead them to perform abortions for women among the boat people of Southeast Asia who have been raped by pirates. That was an issue at the time. Such a center would also clarify for governments the moral foundations of so crucial a right as the right of refugees to asylum. That's almost this morning, isn't it? Such a center, if truly apocalyptic in scope, would challenge the very foundations of a national sovereignty that treats unarmed refugees as an invading army. 1985. But perhaps the greatest difference between the pastor and priest and that of the apocalyptic prophet is in tone and style. Apocalyptic language is not that of cool analysis. Apocalyptic is sweeping in its outlook, not just personal care, but the health of nations, not only the regulations of one country, but the habits of the entire world. Apocalyptic language can be blunt, even harsh. It imparts information in order to call commitment. But, see, this is what he wanted the Ethics Center to be. One of the things, Roy was very rarely despondent. I think as a matter of self-discipline, he would not allow himself to become discouraged. As a youngster, he had had some really emotional difficulties, which he described as having an emotional breakdown when he was in the academy, and he was not going to have that happen again, and he was going to be cheerful no matter what. But he was quite pensive toward the end of his life when he said, we really haven't been able to achieve this kind of thing at Loma Linda. He was leading the Ethics Center at that time, and he felt the frustration that many of us have felt over the years in that to put it very concretely, the School of Medicine is front and center, and in the School of Medicine, surgery is front and center, and in surgery, cardiac surgery is front and center, and then neonatal cardiac surgery. Now, so we put Dr. Bailey's picture up on the great billboard, and he's a friend of mine, and I don't think he would object too much to me saying so, because he himself has been very interested in world famine, so he has that other side to him. But what's happened is that the Kellogg heritage of being both great in surgery and great in public health has withered to the place where our public health school is languishing. It's really in trouble. And why should that be? The public health school on this campus should be prominent. It should be front and center. It should be picking up things that nobody else is picking up worldwide. But our School of Public Health is literally imploding. And Roy could see that. He was very pensive about it. Very pensive about it. Now Donna is a doctor, she's a lawyer, but she's also a public health officer with an MPH from Berkeley. It's okay if you can't get to Harvard, go to Berkeley.
Yes, I've been told that. Roy wanted us to leave out bio in the Ethics Center title. He was unhappy. At least I remember him saying that.
That's right. That was another way of narrowing the scope.
Narrowing what.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to add one post.
Go ahead.
About the women.
Speak up a little bit, Donna,
I'm
please.
sorry.
I was just going to add a postscript about Roy and Walter Brueggemann. The friendship went both ways. One of his last, and you probably know this, meetings with Brueggemann was at breakfast they had together a few weeks before he died. And Brueggemann sent a very nice note along with a donation to Loma Linda after when he learned of Roy's passing. So it was a mutual admiration relationship.
Well, thank you for saying that. I did not know that. I knew of the friendship, but I didn't know that friendship went that far. That's very,
I think I have that.
very helpful. Just while the phone's going around the circle, let me just reemphasize something that I didn't read it, and we don't need to keep reading, but Roy says, I hope you'll invite poets and not just philosophers to your campus. And I really did prepare a very careful presentation for this morning, all logically put out. And when I looked at it, I said to myself, Roy would hate this. he would just hate it, because all structured points, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, you know, and sort of like Thomas Aquinas would write, but he was much, in the old days, he'd be much more like Augustine than he would be like Thomas Aquinas, you know, just flowing poetically. And he was, one time I was about ready to go to class, and he asked me what I was going to teach, and I told him, and it was a review of major ethical theories, beginning with Plato, right on down now to John Rawls. And his comment was, well, I guess you're going to spend a quarter walking around the tombstones of the dead. Well, you know, for a very good friend of yours to say that, it kind of stings, right? And it took me a while to sort of dig out from under that, really, you know. Roy doesn't think what I'm doing is okay, but now I'd like to go back and make a theoretical point. And that's that page at the top, number 1. In the world of ethics, there is this tension, rivalry, sometimes open conflict between those who emphasize values, those who emphasize virtues, those who emphasize vision, and those who emphasize verdict. And I think that that's really misplaced. I think any comprehensive moral theory is going to have all 4. And that we should recognize that some people have talents that are stronger in one way than in another, but that for some people to say that their form of doing ethics scholarship is superior to someone else's, I think it's fine to say, we want to be poetic. I want to be poetic and not analytic. Fair enough. But I do think we need some analytic people around too. Otherwise, the poetic people get all out of control. So the analytic people get boring, and the poetic people get dangerous. So we need each other, and so we need all 4 of these together. Okay, Dr. Ranzel.
A question for you, Dave. First, a comment. Thank you for helping us understand Roy better. This is very helpful for me because I only had the privilege of really getting acquainted with him for about 6 months. I landed here in January of 2015, and I think you said 3 years to the day was the day he passed away, July 7th. So, but I do recall sitting in his office talking about a number of things, and one of those was that book for book club on John Harvey Kellogg. Remember that?
Yes.
I think he's the one that chose it, and we had it at his place.
Right.
So I remember talking about it after we both had read it, and I just said, you know, there are some Christian Science impulses that flow out of this book that we see resonating here at Loma Linda. And he felt the same way, and we both felt that before the book club event and after, none of our colleagues seemed to have grasped that. We were the only 2 that saw the dangers percolating here along those impulses. So I'm wondering, would you characterize that as a fair assessment of how he thought of this place with those concerns? And you note here that his book that he thinks of Scripture that best captures this place is Proverbs? Surely there was a New Testament document as well that...
Well, he thought we were pretty well stuck in the rut of Proverbs.
Is that right? But comment on his understanding of this place, its theology, its strengths and weaknesses. How did he see Loma Linda?
Well, I'll comment on that, and then I'll just have other people in the room who knew Roy very well do so as well. I think that both genetically and emotionally and historically, Roy's roots were very deep in the soil of Loma Linda, and that in the soil of the Adventist Church in general. So he would, if he had a quarrel with the institution, it was always a lover's quarrel. But I also think that he was of the view that Loma Linda had gone too far in a high-tech, low effectiveness direction, and that it needed to invest itself in broader, wider, more beneficial for larger groups of people sorts of enterprises. And you're right, that night you and Roy were the ones who picked up most of all in how Loma Linda had sort of appropriated one side of Kellogg's contributions but not as strongly the other side. I think that's what's marvelous about Kellogg. He had many, many faults and failures and so forth, but he did have an amazing ability both to change the eating habits of the whole world, on the one hand, and then to keep his fingers nimble for surgery by doing knitting while riding on trains. So he was both, and I fear that we should not in any way depreciate the School of Medicine or surgery or anything like that. But it's not so much that they have done well, it's that somehow we have let the other slip or slide or otherwise degrade. So I would think that he had a love relationship with the place. His brother was here, his mother was here. His father had some businesses in the area after his father was ill. So, yeah. Donna, anybody else want to comment on that? How would you describe Roy's attitude toward the institution and then maybe Adventism in general?
Well, as you've already said, his roots were very deep in the Adventist church. Not quite as deep in Loma Linda, I think. And I always, maybe this is a pop psychoanalysis, I thought some of it went into his relationship with Bruce. Bruce was what Roy was not, and vice versa. And I don't want to overdo that. They were the closest of friends. I think any relationship that in his life that was the most close was his relationship with and love for his brother. But there was also a certain tension, because this is the medical end of Adventism and the theological and ethical side kind of embodied in those two men. And they had a lot of discussions and tensions about it, and I think there was a certain amount of, I don't want to say rivalry, sibling rivalry, but in a sense, that's a bad metaphor, but nonetheless, there was that element of concern on at least Roy's part, as far as I know, that too much of the energy of Adventism was here rather than broader, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's right. No one would be more protective of the other than those two, but they did have different temperaments, different priorities. One of the funny stories Roy used to tell was that I think when they were in Egypt, I think it was Egypt, during the war, Second World War, Bruce had become quite an adept stenographer. And the United States Army would come and pick him up and drive him off in a limousine to do stenography work at the military base. And that sort of left Roy on the sidelines, and he said, well, Bruce would drive by and wave like that to Roy. Stand. He's in the big limousine, Roy on the curb. So these are things he remembered. But, he was very protective of Bruce. On the other hand, when Roy went down to Selma, Bruce was very supportive of that and protective of that. So it was a good relationship, I think, between brothers. But brothers are not identical, even when they're twins. Yes.
I'm embarrassed to say I knew absolutely nothing about the sponsor of and patron of the Sabbath School for the 6 months I've been attending here. So thank you for this background. When I received the questionnaire in a flush of self-righteousness, I said I will not introduce uncertainty into my theology. But I'd be very interested what anyone might suggest he would say to this little Sabbath school class. Is this what he envisaged, as the patron of the Sabbath school? If he was here today, in just one or two sentences, what might he say to this Sabbath school class? And is there anyone in this Sabbath school class that would want to send him a particular thank you or message? It would make it more personal for me.
Here.
I can tell you that we decided, we need to decide this today, because it's time to decide, we decide on an annual basis every time in July whether we do it another year. And we have to make that decision today because it's July, it's time. We don't need to meet another year. And Roy and I never took that for granted. So it's time for us to decide. We agreed once we made that decision we would go through the year as a whole without the least bit of wavering. No matter what happened, even if it came down to just the two of us, we would keep meeting. But what would he think? I think that he would be happy that things that are being done here are getting a wider exposure around the world by virtue of the videoing. I think that that's right. On the other hand, I think he would be disappointed that we haven't featured young people who are up and coming in graduate school and so forth. That was a very important thing to him, and quite strategically, I have thought it's better not to have the unevenness that creates. Some of these young people are really, really good. Some of them are not ready for this group, and that made it a little uneven. And I think our programming has been more consistently good for having made that decision. But I think he would feel a loss there because we haven't been as nurturing of young people coming up as he would have preferred. In general, I think he would be happy, but he would do some things differently. He did some things differently, and he would do some things differently now were he here, I'm sure. Anybody else want to comment on that? Peter, were you going to say something? No?
Not about this. Of
Go
course,
ahead.
I'm in favor to continue the class. I think it's very important to continue his legacy.
Mhm. Well, at some point, it will, and I don't know if this will happen in my lifetime, but at some point there will be no one who remembers Roy. And the class will have to change. Maybe then it will be called the Mountain View Sabbath School class. But for now, I'll take a vote in just a moment, but for now, I think it stays Roy Branson. Yes?
Yeah, I didn't know Roy at all. There was probably several people in here who didn't know Roy. But we love the format of the Sabbath school. So
Okay.
whatever you call it, this has been the most helpful.
This has been the most helpful.
Okay, I would say the class has been very supportive financially. We are very grateful for that. We're going to be able to buy better equipment here very shortly, which will help us to be on the internet even more effectively. But it used to pain me, and I think it pained him, that people would work very hard. It typically takes a person who presents here about 8 hours to prepare. People would work very hard, and then that would be it. But with these videos, we're getting wide exposure from all over the world. Yes, Peter?
Yeah, I know very well that he was very much interested in the social problems, especially social justice. And I want to have a discussion with him, but I never had the opportunity to ask him if he believed that the social gospel should be a priority for our church.
Well, I think his answer would be yes, but then he would want to nuance what we mean by social gospel.
Yes.
He definitely would not want to participate in what sometimes looked like a kind of naive optimism that was born from post-millennial thought and evolutionary thought that characterized the social gospel in the early years, the early 1900s. He would not want to go that direction, but to think that the church should have an impact, a positive impact on the wider community, and not just on an individual by individual basis, but do more things like he did in the tobacco industry. I think he would say we should do that sort of thing more. And in addition to that, we should be, one of the most radical things the church can do is to be what the church ought to be. If the church were what it ought to be, it would be so revolutionary that it would not have to do much more. but we are, our witness is plagued by our own inner, I don't want to say failure, it's not that strong, but our own complicated relationship to what we know we ought to be doing. It's very complicated. Yes, Jan, then we'll quit.
I just read a wonderful book called The Soul of America by Nietzsche. I can't remember his first name, was James or Robert, but John, okay. John Meacham, highly recommend it. And I so thought of Roy Branson when he was going through the era, you know, I don't remember what year this was when Roy marched, you know, across the bridge there at Selma, but I couldn't help thinking what courage that took, what bravery, you know. I'd love to hear more about that. And I just wonder if Roy would not be leading the charge for us to, you know, speak out as a class about what's happening with the immigrants at the border.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. One more comment, and we better.
Yeah. David, I'd just like to say, and I've told you before, this is the highlight of my week as a widower, as a 78-year-old. And I think the class has made significant, giant strides in the right direction. And I appreciate everything you've done and the committee has done.
Thank you. Well, the time
It's
has
the only
come.
Sabbath school I've ever loved.
All right. If you think we should do one more year, say amen. Amen. All right. Let's do the benediction. Remember, I like to think of all the thousands of people, the millions of people over thousands of years who have said this to each other. And we identify ourselves with them, part of that long tradition. But we are also mindful that we may not all be here next week. Who knows? We came to Sabbath school one day not realizing the next week Roy wouldn't be here. And that could happen to any of us at any time. So let's read this with these words with that in mind. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. 1 o'clock at the Branson Stadium Zone.
Right, and if you need the address, it's right here on the corner desk. So, thank you, David. That was very, very good. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Sure, thank you for being here.
It's you.